Putin basically is putting nukes back on the table. Now, I'm not saying that's likely to happen, but I don't know how this market gets a lot better with the risk of World War III hanging over our heads. I mean, who wants to enter the market with that on the table?
Alex Karp was on CNBC. He was really, really sharp and concise about this, which is that, in the West, when leaders fail in their objectives, they just get elected out and somebody else takes their place. But for somebody like Putin, there is nobody to take his place because it's a very zero-sum situation. And so his actions will, as a result, also be zero-sum. And I think really kind of like we don't understand well what zero-sum decision-making looks like when it comes to stuff like this. Well, I'll just say two things. One is that I think it's been made pretty clear that both India and China will not stand beside Russia if they do something like this. And I think that is important because they still are the two biggest purchasers of Russian oil. And so I think that matters a lot because you're talking about a lot of revenue that would go away. And then the second is, I mentioned this last week, and this may sound dumb to some of you, but don't sleep on the Russian mothers. What happened this week was really interesting, which is that he calls up all these reservists. These reservists are now coming from the major cities of Russia. You're starting to see protests. You're starting to see young people saying, I don't want to do this. Yep. And who's that really activating? It's activating the moms.
300 people are being... The question I have for you is, do you think, and I know you don't agree with this, but do you think the strategy is to back him into a corner and then have this like rhetoric spike to then force a resolution? I know it's a dangerous strategy. It's a crazy chess move. But do you think that's actually what the West is thinking?
I see no evidence that we have any intentions of seeking a diplomatic off-ramp. I see no evidence that they're looking to give him a golden bridge, like you said.
Then do you think they're trying to break him and have regime change?
I think Biden stated the policy, which is this man cannot remain in power. I think he blurted out the truth of his policy. This is a regime change policy. That's what they're going for. They are backing him into a corner.
Jacob, I thought that you were right this whole time, which is we're going to build a golden bridge. We're going to find a way to egress this guy. And I'm now sort of in the David camp, which is I think that the stated strategy of the Western alliance is essentially to cause him to make such a categorically catastrophic mistake so as to become a pariah, so as to either get overthrown or something. So I do think that on balance, the risk is now for things to escalate, maybe not in quantity, and I'll use this word in the wrong way, but quote unquote, like the intensity of it. So I think David's right. It's a lot of pressure to the economy and to
high-risk strategy.
There's a high-risk strategy. We got a good thing going over here. I don't see the need for all this risk. The thing I have the most trouble with is if you look at the media portrayal of this. So I said last week when we had this successful counteroffensive that maybe we'll get what we want, which is Russian morale collapses and they just tuck their tail between their legs and go back to Moscow. Or maybe the Russians really do see this war as existential for them. Putin sees it as existential for himself, and he escalates. Well, what happened this week? We went up a rung on the escalatory ladder. Basically, Putin drew down 300,000 more troops, and he's basically indicated his willingness to use tactical nukes, and he's basically said, I'm not bluffing. So now, what is the reaction in the American press? He must be bluffing. That basically is the reaction. And look, I don't know how you know that. In poker, what do we do when someone we put them on a range. It's called a hand range, right?
Yes.
You can't possibly know exactly what they're going to do or what cards they're holding. So you put them on a range of possible hands, and then you evaluate the story. Take Putin's story, like Friedberg said. He's never backed down in his life from anything. He has said this war is existential. He basically threatened to invade, and so he did. I mean, I don't know how you can immediately jump to the conclusion this is just a bluff. Maybe it is, but...
Well, it could still be a bluff, but then to your point, the range of outcomes does include shoving on the river, moving all in.
He can move all in. I mean, he's a KGB agent. Do you want to play poker with a KGB agent with nukes?
And by the way, just on this idea that no one would ever use tactical nukes, let me just give you 3 data points. First of all, we used them. We dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II. We could have won that war without doing it, but we didn't want to lose the troops.
Well, no, wait.
They were tactical nuke-sized atomic bombs. Number 2, MacArthur wanted to use 20 to 30 atomic bombs to end the Korean War. He had a whole plan. Truman fired him. He thought he basically had jumped the shark. But MacArthur was the most respected and admired American in 1950. And the reason why Truman could not run for re-election is because he fired MacArthur. MacArthur would have used basically the equivalent of tactical nukes to win the Korean War. And his plan to prevent China from re-invading from the north was to irradiate the border so completely that Chinese troops could not go through it. And we had an American commander, a head of our military, who was willing to use nukes to win a war. So this idea that he wouldn't, I mean, we've been willing to do that. And the third example is obviously the Cuban Missile Crisis. All of Kennedy's military advisors were willing to use nukes. And the best thing Kennedy did was not listen to his military advisors. They were all super hawkish. And Kennedy, what did he do? He looked for a way out. He looked for a compromise. He sent Bobby Kennedy to go cut a secret deal with the Russians, where Kennedy agreed to pull our Jupiter missiles out of Turkey if the Russians would pull their missiles out of Cuba. But that's the kind of, flexibility and mental acuity that I think you would need in a nuclear showdown to avoid a catastrophe. If things do escalate to the point of a nuclear showdown, do we believe that we have leadership on the level of a Jack Kennedy or a Bobby Kennedy who can basically show the flexibility and adaptability to cut a deal to basically pull us back from the brink?
It felt like at the end of last year, you guys remember I thought like conflict was likely this year. I don't think that the conditions I was referencing have really gotten better. I think they've gotten worse. If you look historically, the US has often been in the middle of or at the tail end of some either recessionary cycle or inflationary cycle when conflict escalated. I think that there is an innate human anxiety when things aren't going well. You feel like you have to do something about it, and you're either going to have internal conflict or external conflict as a result to try and resolve. When things are going great, the economy is booming, you don't enter a war. You don't start a conflict with a nation when people are happy at home and the unemployment rate is low and wage growth is high. The economy is growing. Coming out of COVID and coming out of the big question marks that loomed over our economy at the end of last year around inflation, economic growth, interest rates and the effect. And now we're in the middle of the turmoil. Markets are down 30%, and in some cases 70 to 80% for high growth markets. There's an inevitability now that unemployment is going to rise, inevitability now that the economy is going to contract. Leadership is more likely in that scenario to find an outlet, to find a place of conflict. And I don't think it's a conscious decision. I don't think that it's like, hey, let's go start a war with Russia because the economy is bad. I think it's this anxiety, the economy is bad, and there's not a lot we can do about it. And over here, on the other hand, there's a problem and there's something we can do about it. We can build strength and we can build integrity and we can build support and we can get people to get behind something together, and we can get something to create a driving mechanism to achieve something big.
Like a distraction, you're saying, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that psychology is as simple as a distraction or a wag the dog, or, hey, it's not even as simple as the military-industrial complex will see revenue growth and wage growth, and that'll drive the economy. But I think all those things together are true. And I think in whole, we are more likely to want to pursue conflict right now than we were even a year ago.
You buy any of that, Chamath?
I think he's more right than wrong. I think that when things aren't easy, you need to find sort of distractions essentially to get people to focus on other things so that the core problem isn't as obvious. We have in the United States, I think the best way that I can describe this is I see it as institutional rot. And the more that we're left to our own devices, that amount of institutional decay becomes more and more obvious. Our governments don't work the way that they should. Our state assemblies are basically co-opted by special interests. The federal institutions we rely on to make rules are not that great. Enormous amounts of money get wasted every day. And as more and more people become aware of these things, the trend is just so bad. Civic engagement goes down, everything just gets worse. And so when you take that, and then on top of that, you sit it on a poor economy, that is a real powder keg, I think. And so folks I think if you're a politician, it's easier to kind of go and point to Taiwan and say, we're going to go and defend these folks if there's a war, point to Russia and say this, point to all these other things. Whether it's implicit, as Friedberg says, or it's more explicit of a strategy, I don't know. But the underlying cause is the same, which is that if the foundation of the house is not strong and you're not sure what to do to fix it, or you don't have the courage to fix it, the better strategic alternative is to distract and talk about your neighbor's house.
Coming out of the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, Obama recommitted to Afghanistan and sent 17,000 troops to Afghanistan in early 2009. We entered the Persian Gulf with the Gulf War in 1991, coming out of the Great Recession, or the mild recession, 1990 to 1991. 2000-2001 dot-com crash. We obviously entered Iraq. And by the way, you can do the same. You can do the same analysis on the time we entered the Korean War and the time we entered the Vietnam War. They were both tied to recessions, and And so I don't know how explicit this action and behavior is, but I just think there's some data to it.